everyone, and thanks again for joining this new episode of Growthbusters. For those who haven't listened in before, Growthbusters is a series of bite-sized conversations with a variety of B2B experts exploring key challenges that many of the B2B marketing and sales people we speak to are focused on solving right now today. My name is Paul Gibson. I lead the charge for Demandbase business outside of North America, and I'm the host for this series. And in this episode, we're diving into what we think is a really important topic right now, how to maximize the revenue with our existing customers. And today we're going to explore some important areas which are often missed, highlighting the importance of understanding buying signals, the potential risks that we're seeing from customers, and how identifying them helps us not just to retain, but also upsell and cross-sell our existing client base. And to support this important discussion, I'm excited to be joined by an experienced ABXer and also a leading international growth director, Melissa Mawby. Now, Melissa, it's great to have you on the session today. I'm looking forward to our discussions. We've worked together for many years, and despite you retaining your American accent, you've actually been based here in the UK for the last 5 years. Before we get started, for the audience, it'd be great to begin with a little bit about yourself and how you got here today.
Yeah, awesome. Excited to be here. So I started at Demandbase 8 years ago as an SDR, which I think is when we first met at the infamous SKO we were just talking about backstage, and then moved into kind of net new business as an AE, and then obviously moved over to London as an AE, and then made my way to the glorious customer side of the house, which I prefer. So yeah, a few different roles here at Demandbase, obviously.
Awesome. And I think what's really exciting is the progression that you've made. As I said, we met as when you were an SDR, you progressed due to new business, you're now running the growth team internationally here. And I think that's all really exciting stuff. And it also shows the power of, excelling in one area and moving into others. So great to have you on the session today. We'll get started without further ado. I think we know from the many discussions we have with customers and prospects, account-based approaches often seen purely as a demand gen or prospecting solution, find those new opportunities, which of course ABX approaches are really effective at, but pretty much all of our demand-based customers are also using these proven approaches to help them retain, upsell, cross-sell their existing customers. So first question for you, Melissa, in your experience, why do you think sales and marketing professionals often focus on acquiring new business and yet neglect their existing customer base?
I think the simplest answer, and to be honest with you, I work with so many different customers across different industries, different sizes. I would say a good chunk of my customers are sort of in that high growth phase where they need to be generating leads. That just tends to be the emphasis. And I think that need for leads is obviously important and imperative for the health of a business. And coming from obviously SDR and AE roles, I recognize that, both sales and marketing are eager to have a funnel full of leads. So I think the main reason that kind of the customer side and the growth and retention are seen as secondary is because the leads conversation is still such a focus. And honestly, part of and I don't want to call it a problem, because like I said, I'm not at all saying you don't need leads. It's super important that you have a good pipeline. But I think where I've seen some of my customers get tripped up and kind of miss bigger opportunities is when leads are how they're gold, it's how they make their bonus, it's how they're considered to be good as a marketer. And I think they also think, that those leads are what are going to align them with sales and make sales happy. And typically, some of my best customers and healthiest customers, it actually starts from the top down. Leadership is saying of course, yes, leads are just that. They're a leading metric to the types of business outcomes we want, like revenue and pipeline and all of that. But if you only focus on funneling leads into the system, you're not going to be focused on growing a customer, because if you get an opportunity with a customer, there's a good chance you don't even get a new lead out of that per se. You're just focused on working with the team that you're already familiar with and all that. But I think that even though maybe that won't lead to a higher lead count, so many leads words in there, there's just a ton of missed opportunity on the customer base because, first of all, you're already a secured vendor. So the likelihood of you actually being able to move that deal along is much higher because you're not going to have to go through all the hoops that you'll have to secure new business, right? And I think also, like, the reality is, at least at Demandbase, like, I know our old CEO, Chris, used to always tout this, that like a customer doesn't really make your business money until they're a customer for a certain period of time. So if you can focus on that growth and that retention, again, rather than just focusing on leads and actually business outcomes that are important for the health of your business, things like retention and really just ultimately revenue rather than leads, everybody's happy and it's better for the business overall. But I think one of the main reasons that that's always just like a secondary approach is just going back to marketers are gold on leads. Their job security relies on lead generation. And while I think that's super important, again, I think that should be just as important that you're focusing on the customer side of the house as well and growth and retention.
Yeah, great point. And it's really interesting. I still amazes me how many companies have that more leads approach. And that, I know in the B2C world, right, you don't really care where the lead comes from as long as it's a lead because someone might be interested in what you're selling. But in B2B, you end up, if you have that approach, you fill your pipeline with a load of noise. It leads to sales wasting their time on wild goose chases, chasing deals they can't close, missing probably those big opportunities, both for new business and, of course, existing customers. And in many times, the businesses don't want you closing those leads because they're going to lead, to your point, to unhappy customers. It's not a great fit. Retention's going to be lower. So it amazes me, but hopefully over time, B2B companies will start to realize it's not more leads, it's quality leads, be that existing customers or prospects that really matter. Moving on to another point, and this is a term we hear a lot, hunter and farmer. So from your viewpoint, Melissa, what is the hunter and farmer approach to sales and marketing? And when it's done right, how can it help maximize revenue with existing customers?
I think, well, by definition, hunter is obviously sort of that net new mentality, right? Like just going out there, trying to sell, get new leads, new business. Whereas farmer is really about growing existing customer base. I will say, just even to your point before though, like I think that we are already starting to see that shift around leads. And I think that if you can distinguish hunter and farmer efforts, it like helps you to kind of get more visibility into lead quality. Like especially, I mean, as you know, like when Demandbase works with our customers, we have both sales and marketing in the room 90% of the time now, which is newer for us. And once you have that and you can kind of facilitate that alignment and sales is feeding back that the leads aren't quality, it kind of helps the marketer to then petition to the business, like, stop goaling us on this and help us be more strategic and helping the salespeople. But in terms of like hunter versus gatherer approaches, I think, and this almost goes back to our previous point as to like why maybe the hunter approach is most common still, is because I do think the farmer approach is a little bit more complex. So like just to give you an example, like in my opinion, as someone who works with a wide array of customers, I don't want marketing blasting my customer base with the same message, right? Like you want to be more strategic in how you go after your customer base versus you would just like a random company that you think would be a good fit for the business. And on the hunter side, I think that's a lot easier, especially if you have a tool that can tell you like which accounts are in market and what they're in market for to really at scale be able to put marketing programs together that speak to that. But I think the farmer side of the house, it is a bit more complex. Like you need to understand data points like when are they up for renewal? Are they a happy customer? What products of yours do they own today that you can then expand within? And so I think in order to do that at scale, you really do need kind of like a one-stop shop system that can plug all of that into one place for you. And if customers don't have something like that, then it really makes it difficult to kind of make sure that every touch point that you're doing across your customer base makes sense and is strategic. But in terms of kind of some approaches, I mean, I've seen some really great farming marketing programs within my customers. Like, I think the first step to kind of putting together the perfect farming marketing campaign is to align with the customer side of the house, like the people within your organization that work with the customers. I mean, in my opinion, everything about account-based experience marketing is that sales and marketing alignment. And I feel like that rings even truer if you're going after current customers, because that's a much more delicate touch point. Um, but also it's about, again, like having a way of kind of aggregating data that allows you to then put together a campaign that makes sense for the customer and do that at scale.
Yeah, that's great. And this is really good insight. And I think you probably have a pretty unique view on things, because you've done the SDR, you've done the direct sales, you've done the prospecting, and now you're helping clients. And so you're seeing the other side of things. So it's probably a pretty unique value you can offer. And I'm sure the customers who aren't working with you are pretty jealous right now, hearing all this expertise you've got. So it all makes complete sense from my perspective. Are you able to provide some examples of cross-selling opportunities and how maybe our listeners are able to identify themselves within their own existing customer base some opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at Demandbase, we do this day in and day out. It's really about, again, being able to aggregate the data in a way that shows you what current customers are in market for that they don't own today. So like as an example, one of my I probably can't say my customer's name. One of my customers, they were a software asset management company, and essentially they acquired over the course of like 2 years 3 smaller companies, and then they like flattened the org, and it was a lot going on. But because of that, their portfolio expanded like tenfold. Like they were doing IT asset management, they were doing software vulnerability, application services, application readiness, like all these new things that they just were not, it was not in their remit prior to all these acquisitions. And so it made sense. Like our day-to-day contact, like her first thought was like, okay, we need to build a list of accounts that are showing buying intent for application readiness and get a program out to them ASAP. And at the time, like they had done the whole like, okay, we're going to send the email out to our customer base and make everybody aware. But the reality is, in this instance, you're probably going after different stakeholders, like not the person that you work with every day within the account. And B, that's just like one touch point. Like, that's not going to resonate unless you're like really actively like, oh, I was just looking for application readiness software. What are the chances? You need to continue following up with your customer base to identify those opportunities. So what we did was we actually, and it was kind of cool because it really does speak to this well. We had a group of accounts that were just showing intent for application readiness or whatever. I think that was it. And then we took the customer base and we started layering that filter on. So like of our current customers, has anyone been going out and looking for, vendors in application readiness? And so what was cool was we had a completely different go-to-market approach across the net new versus customers, obviously. And a lot of the messaging for the customer base was really about, you now have your application readiness vendor, because it was basically saying like, we're approved. This is an easy win. If you're looking for something like this, we've checked every box for you. We have an existing relationship. We've proved that we're valuable, blah, blah, blah. And so like the landing page was completely different. The actual assets themselves were totally different. But it was using all the same data. Like, are you doing research on these intent keywords? And so what we did is we plugged it into the journeys, not to make this, to Demandbase centric, but we were able to really see that like the time to close, the opportunity creation, but really like that acceleration was the craziest part, because the deals were coming in so fast for the customer base. Because again, why wouldn't you just work with the one vendor you're already with if you're in market for something like that? And that's one of like many wins that I've had from my customer base. And then obviously there's like kind of the retention component too, that I think is huge when you're looking at your current customers.
Yeah, that's a really useful use case, and I'm sure most organizations on the call will appreciate that ability to be really focused. I know I've spoken to many people in the past when they launch a new product, go into a new region or whatever, it's that get that brand out there to anyone and everyone, which again makes sense in the B2C world. But if you're able to identify these are the companies that we can sell to or our existing customers, they're the ones who are in market right now, and you can focus all your efforts there. It means there's no wastage in your budget and resource efforts, but also means you're much more likely to be successful. And going back to our point earlier, filling the pipeline, be that for new salespeople or indeed for the customer team who are trying to expand those accounts, it gives them much more chance of being successful and not wasting time in the wrong area. So I think that's a really good use case. And as you say, I'm sure there's many more you could bring into play there. One thing we hear as a big challenge right now is protecting existing customers, especially when there's competition encircling behind the scenes, often without us. Competitor activity help our listeners today avoid churn risks with their existing customers.
Yeah. And I totally agree on everything you were saying before too, in terms of like the cross and upsell stuff. But I think in terms of the retention, that's probably the second biggest use case that I have with my customers when we're focusing on like how to use ABX to address your customer base. The one thing that I think is just the easiest win to track is understanding if your accounts are looking at competitors. And I just want to caveat too, like everything that I'm talking about is just made better when you're aligned with sales. Like even when we were talking about kind of the identifying cross and upsell opportunity, if you are aligned with your sales org and you can say, here's our customer base that are showing intent for a solution that they don't own with us today, and sales can be joining those calls with the customers and making sure that, they're driving that point home with the marketing air cover, like everything is better. But the same can be said for the retention component. One of the things that I actually really appreciate about Demandbase is the fact that we break out the growth account director and the account director. I do think, Paul, like this is only 3 years now that we've had kind of like that separation, which I just think creates a much better customer experience, because I think it allows the growth account director to really sell things in that make sense for the business. Because as a GAD, just so everyone's aware, like what we're goaled on is first and foremost retention, because that goes back to everything we've talked about with, you're not making profit on a deal until they're customer 2, 3, sometimes even 4 years as a business. So placing that emphasis on the GAD to say, first and foremost, they need to be happy customers is just a better experience for everyone all around. And then it also means that when we as GADs are working to, sell in new solutions, it's because we actually think it's going to work. And so I think it just creates a framework that's really beneficial for everyone involved. And that did not answer your question at all. It was a bit of a tangent, but here we are. But I will say, in terms of like using kind of data and really focusing on retention and identifying competitive risks, again, like both sales and marketing should be getting regular alerts as to if I have a customer up for renewal, are they looking at a competitor? And what's cool is, speaking again to that, aggregated system of like, you need touch points, like when is their renewal up, so that you can start tracking things 1 quarter out, 2 quarter out, 3 quarters out. Like that's all going to influence how you market to current customers. And in this case, it could be like competitive conquesting. Like you really want to make sure that you're kicking out any competitors that are coming in on a company that is up for renewal. So the easiest way to do that is just setting up really simple combination reports of accounts that are working with you today that are looking at your competitors and doing everything you can to mitigate that. The second one though, and I wouldn't even really call this like competitive, but more so just retention focused. We work with like a pretty large HR software company, and a lot of their deals will be like 5, 6, 7-year customers. Like that's the structure of their contracts. And And so they literally had an account coming up for renewal that had been a customer for like 15 years. Like it was such a no-brainer. They assumed they were so embedded that hadn't even been on the website in the last 6 months. And we actually have kind of an alternative use case where we're tracking like logins and things like that using some Demandbase data. They were just not engaged. And so once we, even just beyond the intent, we just found that like they had not been to this website in so long. They were so clearly kind of checked out of that relationship. And then it was a total, like right at the end, we had to get a Hail Mary, try to save them. We started advertising to them, like being really all in on re-engaging this account. So I think when it comes to like competitive conquesting or just retention in general, it's tracking intent for competitors, but also monitoring that web activity and making sure that you still have engagement and that they haven't fallen through the cracks as a customer.
Yeah, that's a really good couple of use cases there, and I think it's so important we take the time and effort to win these clients. We can't just assume that because they're a happy client last year that they're just going to renew. And I think those insights are obviously valuable, and then the ability to put some of these technologies, excuse me, in play to chase them down and make sure they realize that you're still relevant for them is so important. I think we've talked about the timely side of things. That's obviously really important, but relevancy as well is, and when we're in such a competitive environment, it's obviously as important for customers as it is for prospects to make sure that everything we're giving them is relevant. So I wonder, Melissa, what are some effective strategies for personalizing the customer experience that you've seen through areas like targeted content, and how can this help the listeners lead to increasing their revenue with existing customers?
Yeah. I think it's something that I've seen done so many different ways. Like I have a lot of customers, for example, if you're selling into like high growth accounts, which Paul, we can relate to, like a lot of our customers are in that space as well. There's oftentimes going to be a lot of turnover. It's just the nature of a smaller business, right? And so for a lot of my customers, what I've seen work really well is if that's kind of your sweet spot, you need to have an always on campaign going so that, again, like going back to customers slipping through the cracks, you're making sure that no matter where that business falls, if they were happy 5 years ago, that doesn't really matter. If there's going to be turnover, you need to be continuing to engage them, keep your brand in front of them, continue to build that value proposition. And so with the customers of mine that are in that space, they literally have always on programs, and they're just using tools to make sure that the messaging is relevant at scale, right? Like you're not going to create a microsite for every single customer if that's the use case. But then I have another customer, I keep wanting to say the customer name, and it's crazy too, because she's like a one-woman marketing show. She's an absolute rock star. But they sell into like major banks, like JP Morgan, like all these like really major financial institutions. And so she's taken the approach of literally working with that rep directly. They choose, I think it's 10 a quarter. It was cool. We actually like me and the CSM went and spoke at their SKO, and she kind of took us through like the entire strategy. It was super aligned with sales. And she's building microsites, like literally one-to-one microsites, and building out all the content, like stuff to download, etc. And then in my opinion, like that's the extreme on both sides, like the always on, that's just sort of that general engagement. And then the really specific, but again, if they win one of those deals, it will pay for itself tenfold. So it makes perfect sense that they're putting that level of energy into it. But I would say 80% of my customers are somewhere right in the middle. And using things like, again, a data tool to understand where that customer sits in its life cycle. So like, are they happy? When are they up for renewal? What do they own today? And then at scale, being able to just plug and chug in a few different ways that allows it to really speak to that customer. Because to me, at least, like there's nothing worse. Like if I can only imagine if I'm a marketer and I'm spending $100,000 on a platform or whatever, if I'm a customer and I'm spending $100,000 on a platform and I get a generic ad, I'm like, yeah, I know what you do. I spend $100,000 with you. So I think it's about making sure that the messaging reflects and is upfront. Like we value your business, and like sort of that and strategy, rather than hitting them with the same generic message you're going to give everybody else. And there's a ton of tools to do that. Like again, obviously Demandbase can help there if you want to talk about like dynamically personalizing ads or the website, like that's all great. But even with like marketing campaigns that are happening via email, like there's a ton of different ways to just making sure that your messaging, again, reflects on the fact and acknowledges the fact that this is a customer of yours and that you appreciate that. And then having kind of scalable ways of personalizing the message to say, here's how else we think we can help, is just like a much more strategic touch point if you're going to go after the current customer base.
Yeah, thanks, Melissa. And I'm sure the listeners will agree with me. What you're showing here is the level of knowledge you've got and experience, and it's great that you and the rest of the team are able to provide that to our clients. So anyone listening in who wants some assistance on any of these things, obviously Demandbase crew are there to help you. But more importantly, I think we've probably just scratched the surface. So I'm sure there's other sessions we can dig into. And one of the things we always ask for feedback on after this is, are there areas you want to dig into more detail? So any listeners, if there are, please let us know through LinkedIn, and we're happy to set up more detailed sessions on any of these. So it's been a great session. We're coming up on time, Melissa, but before we close out about the session, if you don't mind, a couple of fun facts about yourself. So firstly, is there anyone in particular you follow online, any podcasts you listen to that you think our listeners could benefit from?
My newest obsession, because I read his book, is Max Lugavere. He wrote this book called Genius Foods. It's really interesting, but his podcast it's like health oriented, but it's also like he brings in guests from all across the spectrum, and he's just like a really good interviewer. And I'm like obsessed with him right now. And it's called, I think it's literally called The Genius Life is the podcast. And he has people coming on that talk about like business stuff, health stuff, fitness. It's really good.
Awesome. We might get you to put a link to that in the chat later, but yeah, thanks very much for that. And finally, I know this is the bit everyone hates. One thing people don't know about you that they'd be surprised to know about Melissa Mawby.
Well, you won't be surprised, but pretty much any day of the year, I can tell you how many days away Christmas is, because I love Christmas, and it's 159 days away. And I just had my hen do, and it was Christmas in July themed.
Awesome. Yeah, I can definitely confirm that is the case, and it won't be long before your Christmas tree goes up. So exciting. Brilliant, Melissa. Thanks ever so much for today. I think the two takeaways I probably would get from today's session. Firstly, if you take the time and effort to win a new client, their ongoing engagement experience with you is so important. Your understanding of that experience and engagement is so important, and it's vital to ensure you both retain and grow those clients, that you know that information. And finally, understanding that anonymous activity. If your clients are exploring competitors or showing signals of interest in projects which offer potential upsell or cross-sell opportunities, this gives you the best chance not only to retain, but also increase the lifetime value of your customer base. So really interesting stuff. So thanks very much, everyone, for listening today. And please look out for other episodes in the Growthbuster series. We've got titles like Stop Advertising to Companies You Can't Sell To, Metrics B2B Marketers Should Be Reporting On, Understanding and Controlling Buyer Journeys, Demystifying Intent. Above all, remember, thanks again for your time. We ain't afraid of no growth.